Supplement number 50A.
Lot number 63, Emily Carr.
Sir, sir, thank you. 575,000.
675,000.
$50,000.
320,000.
That's your 675,000.
Sold $1,050,000.
Selling now at $1,450,000.
An artist's reason for being is to create a body of work whose meaning transcends time through history. To accomplish this coveted immortality is somewhat of a mysterious journey. Andy Warhol did it with soup cans. Warhol didn't invent the pop art movement of the 60s, but he was its iconic superstar, amassing billions of dollars along the way. Today, many of the great Canadian artists who redefined Canada's art scene in the past are only becoming popular now, as auction houses and collectors seek out these masterpieces. What are the roadblocks that face Canadian artists struggling for recognition today? 8 talented artists share their secrets of making it into the centric circles of the art world. In 1912, Tom Thomson and the Group of 7 shocked the world with their provocative landscapes. Critics of the day didn't believe it was worthy of being called art. Thomson ended up being the most significant Canadian artist of the first half of the 20th century. Did Thomson have to die for his paintings to trade in the 7 figures? In the 1940s, abstractionist Paul-Émile Bourgeois led an artistic group known as Les Automatistes, who wanted to modernize Quebec art. Bourgeois' star student, Jean-Paul Riopelle, went on to be represented by New York City's prestigious Pierre Matisse Gallery. Riopelle was a unique blend between the European and North American avant-garde, a cross between Jackson Pollock and Matisse. He enjoyed incredible popularity at a time when abstract painters were worshipped like movie stars.
You would never believe how appreciated he was, how a huge star he was. And he was capable, being such a star, of having all those galleries and museums invite his friends, his other artist friends, to be exhibited and promoted.
In 1949, he moved to Paris, where he capitalized on his reputation as the wild Canadian.
Riopelle was associated with a group of artists in Paris, some of whom didn't stay there, let's say like Sam Francis, for example, or the critic John Ashbery. But at a certain time, they vitally participated in the construction of his artistic identity. And that forged who Riopelle was as an artist.
In this global market that we live in nowadays, contemporary global art market, an artist may be a Canadian or Quebec born, but he'll never be as big or as amazingly successful as Riopelle was.
It's because he's in Paris, because he's in dialogue with European art and with New York and American art, that he is Jean-Paul Riopelle.
Since his death in 2002, his work has been reaching huge prices at auctions.
One of the keys to our business is getting the great consignment, getting the $1 million Riopelle or the famous Bourgeois painting or the $1 million Emily Carr. So it is important for an artist to be able to sell an auction and have that secondary market, but it takes time. They have to have galleries across the country or museum recognition and things like that.
Michael Snow is a companion of the Order of Canada, and his works are exhibited in major museums around the world. Known as the creator of the structural film movement, he is considered one of Canada's most important living artists. Today, he continues to be a prolific painter, photographer, sculptor, jazz musician, and filmmaker.
In high school, I had started to play, and it was professionally in the sense that I played jazz. I was playing jazz. And then when I went to OCA, I got interested in painting, but I continued to play. That's a painting I did in 1947 when I had my conversion to jazz.
Well, he's a very extremely gifted, versatile artist. His films, experimental films, are extremely important. Still, very high regards for the his contribution in that discipline.
The core of my work has been photographic work, and I think I've done something special with ways of making art with photography. So that includes the films, but also gallery art, photo works.
Well, we not only have a career-spanning holding of his work that might number about 100 artworks, but we also have Michael's archive, and that's a way of allowing viewers to really understand the breadth and depth of a great artist's thinking.
Joyce and I decided to move to New York in '61, which we did in '62. There we discovered the so-called experimental film world. At any rate, a critic, P. Adams Sitney, wrote an article identifying a new school called structural film. But one of the ironies of his article is that he describes what a structural film is, and the description only fits one film, my film, Wavelength. It's very odd. Anyway, that's how we became structural filmmakers.
He's fascinated by the process of vision, the vision process. How do we see with our own eyes, but also how do we look at things through all the lenses?
One of the first things I started thinking about was the zoom. And zooms are not natural in a certain sense. They're a function of optics. I wanted to do something where that specific technique was one of the things that was strongly experienced in the film. And it led to other work that uses panning and various other cinematic possibilities in ways that make them kind of featured.
The Walking Woman becomes this emblematic image that projects Michael Snow's artistic vision, and it's very much of an open and pan-media vision, and that defines the 60s, which ultimately actually culminate with his filmmaking and also sculpting.
I realized that I had a positive and negative, and that I had a stencil, that this was repeatable. I could paint in it, or I could draw around it and make another one, and so forth. And the repeatability seemed kind of interesting. And then an important arrival was the idea of putting it in different locations and photographing it. Now, I hadn't really worked with photography before that, and that really started me on considering photography as another tool for making art. What I thought as the final work was the 11-part stainless steel sculpture I did for Expo 67 in Montreal, which was a competition for art for the Ontario Pavilion. And this was the most public of the things that I'd ever done, so I thought that was a good place to end. I decided to try to work with an outdoor space, which became thinking about trying to do a landscape. That became La Région Centrale, which is 3 hours. So we made this machine that uses a remote-controlled technique that moves the camera in these really unprecedented movements.
I think he's a cult artist outside of Canada. And so among curators and critics, very well known. But then if you expand the concentric circles of the art world out, I would say that he's not well known enough. He's not as well known as he needs to be and as he should be. And that's an interesting problem, a problem faced by many Canadian artists. And it has to do with the size of this country, but also I think with often the lack of success that we as a country have in exporting our excellent artists.
Michael Snow is Canada's best-kept secret outside the art world. In 2004, the Université de Paris awarded him an honorary doctorate. The last artist awarded this honor was Pablo Picasso. Some Canadians might only know Snow for his sculpture of geese hanging in the Toronto Eaton Centre, which became embroiled in a moral rights lawsuit when Christmas bows were attached to their necks. Like so many other Canadian celebrities, Snow remains better known around the world than he is in his own country. When Canadians flocked to the Andy Warhol Live exhibit at the Montreal Museum of Fine Art, they went to admire the work of an American superstar. Warhol had turned the art world upside down by appropriating images of everyday life and transforming them into iconic pop art. His fascination with celebrities, fame, and mass media advertising fueled his unmistakable style.
Warhol self-produced himself. Warhol didn't let the galleries, fashion him and the museums say, who was Warhol and who was not. He really self-produced him. He produced his own image at the same time that the globalized media phenomenon takes place in the 60s. In the logo culture that we're in, we know how the younger generations and the older too are so sensitive to brands. I think Warhol is like the ultimate artistic brand, and it's really cool.
Branding means you're known and you may then sell art to collectors. Wealthy collectors very often who need to be reassured by who? By the galleries, by the dealers, by the art critics, who all of them will put together, will help each other brand a select group of artists, because it's comfortable for them to do it, to be a group that will all say in one voice, a big voice, that such and such artists are the big ones and the most promising, or the ones that are actually making it. So the collectors looking to buy those works of art by those artists will do it almost blindfolded.
Perhaps no other Canadian pop artist knows more about brand culture and how to spin ideas into art than Douglas Copeland, author of the cult bestseller Generation X. Copeland describes his exhibit at the Monty Clark Gallery in Vancouver as a continuation of where Warhol left off.
Well, the whole show here, as you can see, it's about Andy Warhol, who is very, very important to me. Most young artists at some point secretly think that they're the new Andy Warhol. But in spite of this enormous shadow that Warhol cast, no one ever actually really does work that works with his stuff or with his format explicitly. And I became kind of fascinated with how teenagers desecrate other people's photographs with cigarette burns, foil, arts and crafts material, fruit labels, stickers, very, very humble stuff. And so I thought if I was going to desecrate the Marylands, I thought I would do it in the style of teenagers. I mean, here's this guy I think he never created a unique image of his own. It was always someone else's image that he modified. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll just take it the next step further. It's not that big a deal, and just modify it. These pieces are just an homage. And whenever you hear the word homage, does that mean rip-off? No, it's an homage. It really is. And I mean, obviously it's appropriated, it's found imagery. And these aren't real Warhol prints, obviously. They're from this company, I think, in Holland, that is probably the bane of the Warhol Foundation's existence. Technically, these are just collages. So, I mean, if I was to take a photograph of them and reproduce that, then it gets iffy. But even then, no. Now, for the wigs, that's a different direction, obviously. Andy Warhol once made, as a present for Jean-Michel Basquiat, he took a wig and put it on plexi, and I think he put another plexi box on top of it. I come from a guns and ammo family, and my brother's a taxidermist. And so I got to thinking, well, what would sort of the taxidermy expression of having Andy Warhol in your living room be? So along with the artificial hair and the animal hair, we threw in animal fur, which is just sort of a nod to the shaman who is Warhol. And the gold frames around them are sort of, they echo the gold leaf that he used to use in his drawings back in the 50s.
Doug's interesting. Doug's shows always do very well for us. They do phenomenally well in Toronto. He has a much larger audience there. I mean, we'll get over 1,000 people for a Doug Copeland show in Toronto. But there's such a following there for his writing, his film work, everything. Vancouver's a very quiet, laid-back city.
Artists are right-brain thinkers. But in order for them to survive in the cutthroat business side of the art world, they need to get their heads out of the clouds and exercise their left-brain thinking.
Many years ago, we didn't even think about that. That was a bit of a dirty word, the idea of a career. You had to just be a great artist or a great designer, and as a great artist and a designer, the rest would look after itself. But we know how impractical that is and how inappropriate it is not to consider a career. And so more than ever before, we not only think about production, but also about dissemination, about how an artist gets their work out there, or at least knows how to present their work.
And a bit somewhat old-fashioned in the sense that I take on young artists and I foster their talent and their careers, and it's like a springboard to the next step. And with Kim Dorland a few years ago, he was very heavily in debt, and when I did a studio visit, I thought, wow, this is really some exciting work that's coming out of him. And so I put him on a stipend, which is not very common these days, but I figured that if I was to do my job properly, then it was the right thing to do.
But I, in fact, don't look at artists until they've been working for around 15 years. I don't read novels by 21-year-olds either.
I look for artists. I really don't care if they're Canadian, American, or what. I just look for good art. And about 6 years ago, I met James Lahey, and his first show in New York was a sold-out show, and that goes well for cementing relations.
They need to sell. They need to, be out there promoting their work, and it's an important component. But I do think that sometimes, if that is what drives the artist's practice, then it can definitely impede. Something gets popular, and so you just keep making those things, as opposed to pushing yourself and really developing a practice, which is about, well, what are the ideas that you want to deal with, not what is selling. So there are definitely some traps that you have to be aware of.
Working out of Montreal, Peter Hoffer's unique art is sold around the world. He enjoyed early success in the commercial gallery circuit shortly after finishing his Masters of Fine Art.
Can I show my wine opening trick first? That one's not corked, that one's perfect. So for the viewers at home, if you want to see us, number 2 head there on that works best. Well, I was born in Brantford, and Brantford's a hockey town, and I lived for hockey. That's all I wanted to do. Art was something that I did. I never really thought of it as a career, neither did my parents or the high school. When I was at university, I was in the sculpture department. My thesis show was paintings. So I figured that might be able to cross the line, that I could get away with them being sculptural paintings. And so there was a little bit of a questioning brought in there as to what the trucks were representing and what part of history they might belong to in terms of paintings. And that departure from the church as having control over the funding of most artists in the West, and the industrialists coming in, and philanthropy came from a different perspective for the artists. So I look at the transport trucks as that departure, as that symbolic departure for me. This is where the first idea of the backdrop kind of came out, where the paintings of the trucks were done a little bit more realistically than the backdrop, than the landscape. These are all the not to-dos in painting. Everything that you've learned in painting, I'm doing exactly what you're not supposed to do. Including never cleaning your brushes. You should never clean your brush. When I started looking at landscape, it was pretty much kind of a visceral thing. Looking at historic paintings throughout university, whether it be an undergraduate art school or what have you, they're always there in the periphery of the landscape painting, especially being a Canadian artist. Well, I'm just laying down a ground, no pun intended, it is a landscape, but a groundwork meaning like just the background. The idea of a landscape being boring is partly of interest to me. So basically that's what we're doing, is seeing the layers in behind. And this is going to be one of the first layers. So it's kind of just something darker. You don't need anything too fancy. Or maybe I can get away with that and just call it a piece. Maybe I'm done. I started looking at these salon schools with the varnishes over top of the painting. So it was more about the material than the landscape. And throwing the varnish over, whenever an artist would do an exhibition, they would put a new fresh layer of varnish on a painting to make it look new. And then if it didn't sell, they'd go off to the next salon exhibition and they'd re-varnish it the night before with all the artists. So the vernissage, the varnishing. So I do reference paintings, but what happens is I start reading about these works and I start realizing how fantastic some of these works are that I would normally have passed by in a gallery. And a lot of these are studies, and they're painted quite quickly, watercolors as well. And that's what I'm trying to get. I'll just kind of show you what we can do here. This is definitely public television painting lessons, and it's good to always be able to fall back on this. So as you can see, there are no secrets. But this isn't normally how I would, obviously this is not how I'm going to paint the trucks. This is not how I do the abstract. This is just these landscapes. I am starting to grow an appreciation towards the skill of painting. And I'm so far behind, it's not like riding a bike. So I've unlearned everything when I went into the conceptual side, and now I'm relearning it. So we'll see what happens.
I had just started buying and showing his girlfriend's paintings, Dominique Goupil. And it took like 3 or 4 months before she told us that her boyfriend was a painter too. We were probably his second gallery. And we saw him work hard. He's really a fantastic artist and has the personality to succeed to the point where he found galleries to represent him in Toronto, in Banff, in Vancouver, in New York City, in Florida, in Chicago, now in Paris.
I just kind of fell into this commercial gallery circuit. and realize another side. I mean, some galleries have a bottom line of strictly selling work, and they would sell used cars if they could. What I found out is some of these galleries are quite well educated in the, especially the Canadian art scene, and are well aware of other work that's going on, which is a surprise to me. And we're very open to exhibiting work that may not sell. I think good commercial galleries, will do that.
I don't take any submissions to the gallery. If you understand that my interest is in a critical relevance in art history, then those are the artists that are going to show at the gallery. And their commercial, quote, commercial success is based on the critical relevance of their work. I'm in constant dialogue with curators at the Art Gallery of Ontario, with curators at the National Gallery. They are in constant dialogue with me. They are aware of every exhibition that goes through the gallery.
Ian Wallace is represented by Catriona Jeffries in Canada. He is recognized as one of the pioneers of Vancouver's art establishment. A trained art historian and art theory professor at UBC, Wallace was instrumental in developing the city's emblematic brand of photoconceptualism.
What came up in the late 60s, really coming out of the more language-based conceptual art, which I was interested in. It didn't offer a lot of visual interest to a lot of people. In fact, a lot of people always thought conceptual art was some kind of scam of some kind, But it opened up all new ways of thinking about how to make art and how to use different materials. And photography was one of them. I call it photoconceptualism because this use of photography really came out of the, you might say, the linguistic, critical, philosophical aspects that were introduced by conceptual art. I was interested in the idea that you could photograph things in the world and then organize them in such a way, like filmic, cinematic models, that started to talk about the world in a different way. And I think when I take a picture, I think of the photograph as like a brushstroke of an abstract artist. We'll just kind of do a stroke with mixed colors and a gesture that catches your eye, is interesting, and you remember it, and it's the aesthetic stimulation of the work. I'm interested in the downtown core of the city, that kind of sense of collective space, what it is to stand on the corner, the existential moment of it, how people construct themselves as people in the anonymity of urban architecture. And compositionally, my pictures are generally, the urban's pictures are on a vertical axis with a color bar up the side and white, which is the ground of the canvas on the right-hand side. That's sort of a format that I've used for the past 20 some odd years, basically, or even more.
Ian is not only an extraordinary artist, but he's also a very generous teacher and a really significant art historian of this region in particular. So his influence on all levels is felt throughout many generations. And the Vancouver Art Gallery is undertaking an exhibition that will be featured in a few years that will be a career survey of Ian's work, and I'm thrilled to be working on it.
My task as an art historian, which I really love to do, was to make some sense out of all this and then kind of tell the story to younger generations.
Getting works into any museum collection can often involve more luck than winning the lottery. Sometimes wealthy collectors donate pieces for tax receipts, or artists donate their own personal works. For Toronto's photoconceptual artist Scott McFarland, having a solo exhibition came down to good luck and good timing. A graduate from UBC, his retrospective was part of the BC scene.
The Scott McFarland exhibition presents to us the artistry of creating an image, bringing the world to us in this immense detail and color, and celebrating reality in that respect. What Scott has done is he's taken the rear end of the horse that was in one position, and then the front end of the horse, which was in another position, and put the two together. It reminded me of the history of photography, where there was a photographer, Edward Muybridge, who did motion studies with animals and with people.
What I'm enjoying about this exhibition opportunity is seeing photographs that I've made for the last 5 or 6 years that, when I've done exhibitions earlier, have felt relatively fragmented because there hasn't been a larger context for them. And now I'm seeing them together for the first time and kind of completed. I start by photographing my works with a large format camera with negative film and scan that negative film. And with the scanned images, I work with somebody that assists me to do this. We then sort of edit them in a way to create a finished photograph.
There's a different sky in each, and you have to look at them both and try to figure out how that changes how you feel about the work.
Each one of the edition contains a different sky than the other edition of 5. So by that way, each photograph is sort of unique.
Monty just had Scott present his work to us, and I followed his career closely well, since then. That was probably about 9 years ago now, and I've just been struck with his dedication to the craft of photography, and he does craft his images.
So as soon as an artist does a new piece, we're letting curators know. As soon as there's an exhibition, curators are in the know. So there, it was just constantly making them aware of the work.
The Vancouver Art Gallery knows full well the importance of presenting their permanent collection, while at the same time providing a museum venue for Vancouver's emerging artists.
Enacting Abstraction is an exhibition that really emerged out of our permanent collection. What I wanted to do was really activate ideas of abstract art and see how contemporary artists today are really taking up those ideas, how they're extending the principal tenets of abstraction, in some cases even critiquing them. Well, Jeremy Hoffer, of course, is one of the recent winners of the RBC Award, which recognizes young painters from across the country. So it was really exciting to include him in the exhibition. And it was a thrill for me to position his work near some of the more conceptually based artists and painters that came out of the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design in the 1970s and before. So I think it's really important to consider the history of these ideas and how they're taken up by different generations over time.
Very early on, I was inspired by minimalist artists like Don Judd and Frank Stella and Carl Andre, and those, even before I knew anything about art, I gravitated towards those works and those artists.
We have over 600 artists submitting, and unfortunately, we have to shortlist down to 15 paintings.
This is the plan drawing for the layer painting red that the RBC has. It's just mostly a schematic for creating the jig.
So for the 15 artists that were included in 2008, their paintings were seen in 8 museums across the country.
This is a layer painting that went awry. The router slipped off the jig and just got ruined. So it was kind of a bad day. So all that, months and months of work gone into that, gone in a second.
The winning artist receives $25,000, and the 2 runners-up each receive $15,000, and their paintings become part of the RBC art collection.
Well, long term, I'd like to just be making art for a living, like have an art practice, you know, have a home to live in, and like, you know, have everything taken care of and just live a comfortable life, just making art.
For most of us, experimental and conceptual art is difficult to figure out. Be that as it may, it remains a very popular form of art. And for Quebec artist Jean-Pierre Gauthier, the Sobey Art Competition $50,000 first prize provided him with a living for 2 years.
It's my little doorbell. The more significant influence for me was, funny thing to say, but my mother. My mother was a great influence for me because she gave me that toy at 10 years old. From this, I've learned a lot of electronic, and it gave me this, maybe now I think it makes sense with all I've done. I was studying in visual art, in painting, and then drifted a little bit more into installation, and then progressively integrated the electronic component and mechanized stuff, which became kinetic work and audio work as it went on. The Sobey's Art Award was quite a tough competition, actually. I was selected with 25 other artists from Canada. The work that I've shown in that exhibition was actually drawing machines, and also another work called cross-country skiing. It kept me busy for 2 years with that money and working on project without asking grant for those 2 years. So that was good, financially good for me. Musée d'Art Contemporain has made this nice little catalog, and with a lot of work. Not all showed it during the exhibition, but a lot of it was there. Soap objects and previous work. My first exhibition, solo in Montreal. My work was acquired by her first museum was in the Musée du Québec, and the collection of Musée du Québec work. And then Musée d'Art Contemporain in Montreal, Baltimore Art Museum has a drawing machine. National Art Gallery, they don't have a work of mine. But I had a show with José Drouin-Brisebois about Quebec artists.
He is somebody that fits into the more experimental art that is coming out of Quebec. And that's what I was trying to get out of that exhibition as well, where these artists that maybe are not so much in museum collections because of the type of work that they're doing and the materials they're using. But Gauthier is really interesting in terms of how he's using music and his whole history in music and sculpture and creating these animate objects that are quite whimsical but also very serious, because he's interested in the kind of theories of the Big Bang, how life started and whatnot. So there's a real philosophy as well behind it.
I have a gallery in New York, a Jack Shaman gallery. Sometimes they drop in money a little bit to produce some work. Moving and reconstructing, it's very hard to sell to private collectors. So for me, if I wouldn't have grants, my work would die, would disappear. Eventually it's going to be programmed to do that. There's no other alternative yet, unless there's a very serious market developed on collecting, and a museum could buy more stuff. Also, they don't buy so much. If they buy one installation, usually that's the only one they will buy from an artist. So once you've done the 5 major museums in Canada, things could be rough after that. So.
a lot of artists in Quebec do very well in terms of looking at their work more from an experimental way, because of the grant system in Quebec is very good. There's a lot more money there than anywhere else in Canada, and then the Canada Council as well. So there are grants in place. There are also corporations that are interested in supporting the arts. Nuit Blanche is a great example. It's also about being creative and trying to find solutions.
Toronto-based artist Katherine Harvey has found the secret recipe for how to mix commercial gallery success with installation art. In 2008, she won the Scotiabank Nuit Blanche People's Choice Award.
I like to paint about magic and play with the three-dimensional qualities of the images, make them kind of three-dimensional and magical so you can't quite tell what you're looking at, but you sort of get perhaps a feeling from it, or it gives you an idea, it reminds you of a memory. I'm very interested in tapping into lost memories. And so I started making paintings of these storefront windows, and then I thought, well, maybe I should make my own storefront display as sort of a branching out, and then photograph it and paint it. And so I started thinking along those lines. And then I started getting opportunities to show in windows, in storefront windows. People were asking me to do bigger things, but to work with glass, for example, would be very expensive and very heavy. So I thought, what kind of material can I get my hands on that's not expensive? Well, recycling, it's free. And there's a lot of it, unfortunately, in our society today. And started making them into waterfalls or fountains. And then a brilliant opportunity came up to do the piece for Nuit Blanche. And they wanted me to work as large as I could. I can't do installation work all the time because there's so much administration and emailing and coordinating and a lot of logistics to work out, and it's not so hands-on. So I like to actually work between the two and have breaks from one to work on the other. So it's a good combination. Because my work does cross over to the commercial side, I have been able to make some money from my work, but certainly I have gotten grants at all three levels, federal, provincial, and city, and they've helped me enormously. I got into a group show at Nicolas Metivier Gallery. It was a group show in August, and it was sort of a test run of a bunch of artists he'd been watching for a while. And I think I sold over a dozen paintings, and it's just been very, very busy since I've joined with him. It's nonstop.
A balance of right brain and left brain thinking is how brilliant artists are making it in today's global art market. Inside the secretive inner sanctums of the art world, experts have their own take on an artist's success.
But, success is elusive. Elusive, I think, since the time that, let's say, Andy Warhol first defined success in his terms, which was a kind of super success, a stardom, celebrity, and definitely had to do with money. But that would not be for everyone. And so how should one define success? And I think that that's ultimately up to every artist to figure out for herself or himself.
Museums try to keep track of who the rising artists are, but even they admit it's difficult to predict who the next stars will be.
It's an interesting position to be in as well, because we don't exactly know what's going to happen in the future. So you are kind of doing educated guessing in a certain way, especially with some of the lesser known artists, but that's what we do. And if you're successful in half of what you're acquiring, then I think you're doing a very good job.
Artists Emily Carr and Jean-Paul Riopelle are just some of the Canadian stars driving up bids at today's auctions. But for the world to see the likes of another superstar like Andy Warhol, fame might just have to overshadow talent.